Hi, my name is Tariq Ware, and I teach at Augustine Classical Academy in Mechanicville, New York. My 8th grade Latin students are reading the famous passage of Augustine's Confessions, in which he's converted in a garden. They are in their second year of Latin, and here at the end of our second year, our textbook hasn't yet taught us some of the Latin grammar that you need to read a passage like this. For example, we never learned from the textbook deponent verbs, the subjunctive mood, or indirect statements. So to help us sort of demystify this passage of Latin and separate out, basics of Latin grammar that we've known for years, like subjects and main verbs and direct objects, from some of the new grammar we've encountered, I've made a color-coded edition of our text, and we'll go through it. So to follow along, you will need to take note of these colors. So for basic grammar, we've got red, blue, and green. We've got subject, verb, object, blue, green, red. If we said, puer, puellam videt, the boy sees the girl, the boy would be blue, the girl would be red, and the verb videt, sees, would be green. So let's have a look here. We sort of start in medias res with this main verb. He remained, ille mansit. Therefore, this is Augustine's friend Alypius that he was together with. He remained where we were seated. And in what state did he remain? Well, we'd never seen participles before either. So we recognize that you can take any verb like stupeo and make an active participle from the first principal part. It ends in ens entis, and it's a participle just like English. So ending in ing. So if stupeo means I am amazed, this means being amazed, or we could just translate it amazed. So all right, so he remained therefore where we were sitting, extremely amazed, nimie stupens. I, the subject of our new sentence in blue, under a certain tree of fig, the Latin way of saying a fig tree, I threw myself down, stravi me. Turns out that the I is both the subject and direct object of this one because he did something to himself in some way or another, nescio quo modo. And I let loose the reins to my tears. I gave free rein to my tears. And new subject, flumina, the rivers of my eyes. I think we know what those are. Those are his tears. The rivers of my eyes burst forth. Then we get an appositive to describe these rivers of my eyes, taken from the Psalter. Your acceptable sacrifice. Of course, Augustine's always speaking to God. His entire book is one long prayer, so the second person is going to refer to God. So Augustine is saying that the rivers of these eyes of mine burst forth, and he's calling those tears of his an acceptable sacrifice to God. And something else happened. We finally get our verb down here. I said many things to you. So we started talking to God, but we get some words in between we need to consider. This is his verbis is an ablative of means or instrument. I said many things to you, God, not indeed by means of these exact words, his verbis, but in this gist, in hoc sententia, and something with this meaning. And this is Augustine's approximation of what he told God at that moment. I went ahead and made two nominative, subject, blue, because it's going to be the subject of our verb irasceres. And we never learned deponent verbs. What are deponent verbs? Deponent verbs are, when you look them up, they don't end in an O. It's not irasco, it's irascor. So all the endings are passive. We learned the passive endings or, eris, itur, etc. And we're used to, and a verb like amor, amaris, amator, we translated I am loved, you are loved, he, she, or it is loved. But on this verb, the definition of a deponent verb is all the forms are passive, but the meaning, the translation, is entirely active. So irascor, if you look it up in the dictionary, it says to be angry. So we have to remember how futures are made in the third conjugation. The mantra I like to teach my 6th graders is chop off the O and add ace, ate, amus, atus, ain't, to remind you that this E vowel shows up. In this case, we've chopped off the or and we're adding eris aetur. So that's a future. All right, so tu iras scaris. All that's just to say that we can simply translate this in the future with an active meaning despite the passive form as you will be angry. But it's a question, there's a question mark. You, Lord, until when? Until when, Lord, will you be angry? Infinem, a relic of translation, we're going to translate that forever. Ne fueris. So all right, now the new grammar gets thick and heavy. It's the perfect subjunctive. Looks a lot like a future perfect indicative, doesn't it? The forms are mostly the same, but ne plus the perfect subjunctive is a way of giving a negative command, and we call it the prohibitive subjunctive. So in this case, it's a linking verb with a predicate adjective. Do not be mindful, still talking to God, do not be mindful, and in fact, quoting the Psalter again, of my former iniquities. Okay, mindful of takes the genitive in Latin, just like the of in English. Okay, what we have coming up now is an indirect statement, really important Latin construction, where if you have a verb that means something like I say, I think, or I hear, what very often follows in English is going to be that. We want to report, it's called an indirect statement, what was said, heard, or thought. I think that you're a swell friend. I think that it's hot today. He said that he was coming a little bit late to the party. I heard that Washington had crossed the Delaware. All right, here, so we're always going to need a verb of thinking, feeling, or saying of some kind. Here our verb is sentiebam. For I felt. And so the whole rule of indirect statement is, with that, of course, we need, like any clause, we're going to need a subject and a verb. I see that you, subject, are, verb, late. So the funny rule in Latin is we don't need any conjunction. We don't need a word that means that. We just need to take our subject and put it in the accusative, and the verb and put it in the infinitive. Well, here's an accusative may and an infinitive tenere. It's the passive infinitive, to be held. So I felt that I was being held. See, I said that, and then I took my accusative, made it the subject, I, and my infinitive tenere, I made it the verb, was being held. I kept it passive because I can't take the passiveness out of tenere. Now, you might notice that you can get away with a more literal English translation. I felt myself to be being held, something like that. We do say that, you know, I consider him to be a friend. I consider that he is a friend. So sometimes you have the choice of those two constructions in English. But this is the normal Latin construction. I felt that I was being held, like held in a grip by them. Eis, ablative of means or instrument. What are the them? His former sins. His whole life crisis is that he feels so much in the grip of all these sins, the life he's been living. So what did he do? I was casting forth miserable voice sounds. Miserables voces. All right. Clearly he was, you know, howling and making wretched noises. Apparently he was also making noises. Perhaps this describes the tone, the sobbing tone with which he was saying these words. Quam diu, cras et cras, etc. How long? Tomorrow and tomorrow? Why not now? Quare non modo? Why not hac hora? Ablative of time when. Why not in this very hour? An end of my shamefulness, an end of my disgrace. So here I have a blue but no green. What does that mean? In the words that Augustine said, it means he said a subject of a verb in the nominative, an end of my shamefulness, but he didn't give it a verb. We might say the verb is will come, you know, something like veniet. You know, why will not an end of my shamefulness come right now, God? He's very impatient for it, but he leaves out the verb. You could do the same in English. I could come into the room, charge, and say, why no Cheetos today? Why no flamin' hot Cheetos? And I think you'd understand what I meant. All right, going on to our new section. I was saying these things, and I was weeping. Here we get an ablative of manner. We learned in our textbook that when an ablative of manner contritione is modified by an adjective, amarissima. You don't need to use cum plus ablative. You can just have the ablative. I wept. So what was the manner in which I wept? I wept with bitterest contrition. So I wept not just contritely, but most bitter contritely. I said these things, and I wept with the bitter contrition of my heart. And behold, at ecce audio, I hear a voice. Well, it doesn't get more verb, direct object than I hear a voice. I hear a voice from the neighboring house. This threw a little bit of, threw some of my students for a loop. Simply, I think they forgot that domus, the noun that has an us ending and variable second and fourth declension forms, is nonetheless feminine. So wikina is simply an adjective agreeing with in case, number, and gender. Both the words wikina and domo are ablative singular feminine. So from a neighboring house. So behold, I hear a voice from a neighboring house. And the voice comes together with chanting or singing, cum cantu. And here we get some more present active participles. So a dicens dicentis from the verb dico is a saying one. It's just the adjective saying. Repetens repetentis is the participle repeating. But here in the genitive, it's of a saying of a person. So we're just going to explain the fact that we have these masculine singular participles by using person as the noun for them to modify. So I hear a voice of a person saying and often repeating, crebro repetentis. It's a voice as if of a boy or a girl, I don't know. So it seems to be a young voice. And so, well, there we do have some genitive singular nouns that for our decentis and repetentis to agree. And what do the voice say? Nothing but main verbs, nothing but little imperatives here. Take and read, take and read. This famous utterance, of course, meant take and read to Augustine, because he's going to explain how he heard it as a voice from God telling him to pick up the book he had of Paul's epistles and derive from it a message from God for what he should do. But who knows what the boy or girl out there playing in the field actually meant by those words. Probably something a little different. I doubt they played in the fields with precious handwritten books. And immediately what happened? Mutato vultu. Okay, the first of many ablative absolutes. Such a common Latin expression, a powerful way of condensing an entire sentence or subordinate clause into just two words. And so it can be a little confusing, but it's important to spend some time thinking through how it works. What are the two words? Well, the two words, just like the accusative and infinitive in the indirect statement, the two words you need to make a clause are the subject and the verb, right? So we're going to end up translating this with my facial expression having been changed, when my facial expression had changed, or my facial expression having been changed, or just my facial expression changed and something else happened. So we've got the subject, the facial expression, vultus, and we're describing it as being changed. And so how the ablative absolute works is we take a noun and a participle which attributes some verbal action to it. So all right, let's just think about the phrase vultus mutatus. Forget about ablative absolute and subordinate clauses for a second. Let's just think that we could take the noun vultus, which means facial expression, and we could describe it with mutatus. It's a perfect passive participle. It means having been changed, changed. So all right, vultus mutatus is simply a phrase that means a changed facial expression. What's the magic of putting it into the ablative? It's that I can now drop it into any sentence, and it's a whole subordinate clause that means after my facial expression had been changed. So very similar to the logic of the indirect statement, we take two words, and because of the rules of Latin grammar, the fact that they're in the ablative and it's a noun plus a participle, gives us a sort of translation formula to turn it into a subordinate clause. And I actually gave you three ways of translating it there. A compound verb, my facial expression changed, and I began to think, coipi cogitare, what we call in English a nominative absolute. My facial expression having been changed, I began to think. Well, that's not something people say on the street very often, but it has the advantage of literally mirroring how the Latin ablative absolute works. And finally, what's probably, the loosest of our ways of translating it, so use it as long as it's not confusing you. Just take it together with our main verb and turn the whole thing into a compound sentence. My facial expression changed, and I began to think, right? Two things happened. One is expressed with the ablative absolute, one's expressed with a normal finite verb koipi. By the way, what does this mean that his facial expression changed? Well, he's describing the rapid emotional change. His face has obviously been distorted with crying and so forth. So, all right, so suddenly with a change of countenance, I most intently began to think. I translated that as an adverb. It technically says I being most intent, or hurriedly or whatever, began to think. All right, unfortunately, another new grammar in orange. If you have a subordinate clause that's introduced by a question word, in this case, like whether something's the case, it's a yes, no question. He began to think about what the answer to some yes, he's thinking about a question. Like how can I think what a question is? I can think, I began to think what was going to be for dinner tonight. I began to think when I had gotten married. Maybe I forgot that. Here he's thinking about a yes, no question, and the word whether, which describes a yes, no question in subordinate clause, is utrum in Latin, or utrum nam here. I began to think whether children, pueri, were accustomed. So that's an indirect question. Simply that he's not thinking an indirect statement. I think that Donald Trump became president in 2016. Well, that would be accusative plus infinitive indirect statement. It's I think, I was thinking whether it was this or that. I was thinking why, when, who, what, when, where, how, some question word. So I was thinking whether children were accustomed. So that calls for the subjunctive. Here we see the imperfect subjunctive. That's when you basically get the infinitive plus MST mustis und. I began to think whether children were accustomed in some kind of playing to go around chanting something of that kind. Tolle means of that kind, some such thing. Okay, we glossed over ludendi here. Well, it turns out you can take verbs and you can make a verbal noun called a gerund by giving them the undum second declension neuter ending. It exactly means the same as playing. When playing is a verbal noun in English, I like playing. Playing is fun. He killed us by means of playing. That would be ludendo, ablative of means. But here it's just of playing, ludendi, genitive. So in some kind of playing. All right, but he was trying to think whether if there was any kind of playing where kids went around saying Tolle lege. And it did not occur. It was not occurring. And here he uses an indirect statement. So again, that's accusative me plus infinitive audice, that's the perfect active infinitive, to say the subject and verb of the thing that occurred to him, that it was the case. So no, and it was not occurring to me. So we just say that subject verb, okay, ABC, that. There's not a word in the Latin meaning that. That's just recognizing that accusative plus infinitive can be translated indirect statement that. That subject verb, that accusative infinitive. So it was not occurring that I, well, there's my accusative, had heard. It must be farther in the past. That's why we're using the perfect infinitive. At all. It was not occurring that I had heard at all anywhere. Okay, right? Yeah. So he had no recollection whatsoever of such a playful chant in children's games. We get another ablative absolute. If an impetus repressus is an attack, that perfect passive participle has been held back or checked, then here he's saying, and the attack of my tears having been held back, right? The onrush, the rushing on of my tears having been checked, when the rushing on of my tears had been checked, or just the rushing on of my tears had been checked, and I arose, surrexi. Here we get another present active participle, ans antis, meaning interpreting. So it's nominative singular masculine. It agrees with the subject of surrexi. I arose, interpreting, right? I arose, interpreting. And then what follows is another, interpreting is a verb of thinking, so it can take an indirect statement. Here's my accusative, nihil. And here's my infinitive euberi. It's a passive infinitive. So I was interpreting that nothing was being ordered. Now that kind of sounds strange. He was interpreting that nothing was being ordered. I thought he was going to get a command from God out of this. Well, I was interpreting that nothing else, aliud, was being divinely ordered to me, commanded to me, nisi, except for, so we are going to get the order, right? Nothing else, nothing other was being commanded to me except that. Well, here's where it comes, the actual command. And here we learn that ut plus the subjunctive can express a command. So if you want to command something to somebody, instead of using an infinitive in Latin and a subordinate clause, I command that the soldiers go there, and you want to use ut, you could use ut plus the nominative subject, milites, soldiers, and a subjunctive verb. So in this case, I arose interpreting that nothing else was being divinely ordered to me, but that, nisi ut, I open the book and read. Okay, well, there's the Tolle lege, right? I open the book and lead. Quod primum caput inve nisem. Let's take that word by word. Which first chapter I found. Okay, in other words, the first chapter which I found. Whatever chapter he opened to, he was going to read it, whatever. Why did I put inve nisem in the notorious orange for new grammar? Well, it could just be because it's subjunctive, but why is it subjunctive? This is a pluperfect subjunctive. I have nothing better to offer you than that sometimes in clauses that are subordinate to verbs that are already subjunctive for their own reasons, as in this case, the subordinate to the jussive noun clause, well, subordinate to subjunctive is also subjunctive in Latin. All right. Now he's going to explain, Augustine's going to explain why he would even engage in such a weird strategy, right? Randomly opening books to get messages from God. Well, something gave him the idea that could work, and what that thing was St. Athanasius's life of St. Anthony of Egypt. So he's going to explain to us what he had heard had happened to Anthony. If it worked for Anthony, maybe it would work for him. Let's see. Audieram, for I had heard concerning Anthony that, and here, now this is simple and exactly like English. We have a conjunction quod, just like the English that. I only have to call it new grammar because I showed you that Latin indirect statements usually use accusative plus infinitive. And later on, way down here at Esse Conversum, Augustine will give us an infinitive sort of in the same indirect statement, but he starts it just with quod that. So it's just a regular subordinate clause with a normal finite verb. So I had heard concerning Anthony that that from or after the gospel reading, the Evangelica Lectio, the gospel reading on which he had come upon by chance, accidentally, forte, what I had heard was that he had been admonished. Okay, so in this case, it's quod plus a subjunctive. These quod indirect statements can sometimes take indicative, sometimes take subjunctive. He's using subjunctive because it's hearsay. It's a little less certain in that way. That's why Latin uses subjunctive. It's reported. This is what they say happened anyway. So I had heard concerning Anthony that he had been admonished from the gospel reading. Well, okay. As if it were being said to him, sibi, to him himself, reflexive pronoun in the dative. That's the point. He took it as being said to himself. And this, we use the imperfect subjunctive in both halves of what are called present contrary to fact conditions. Present contrary to fact condition is, if today I were a bird, I would be a black-capped chickadee like the one that's been pecking away at my window. Maybe my window was rotten and full of ants. We'll have to look into that. All right, if something were the case, that's not the case, something else would happen. You know, if pigs could fly, they would fly very joyfully. All right, this is really just the if half of it, because tamquam means as if it were being said to him. So that was the present contrary to fact in Anthony's mind. You know, I am feeling very admonished by this gospel reading, as if it were being said to me, myself. Okay, but as an indirect, put into indirect statement, that's, you know, I'd heard concerning Anthony that that he had been admonished, warned, as if it were as if it were being said to him, as if what were being said to him, the thing which was being read, quod legebatur. I made quod nominative because it's the subject of the relative clause. I made nominative blue. The thing which was being said, as if the thing which was being said, we could put in an id to give quod an antecedent, as if id were being said, as if that thing were being said to him himself, which was being read there, by the lector in the church. And here's what was being read. A bunch of main verbs in green. The first three are imperatives, and the fourth one is what will happen in the future indicative if you follow those commands of Christ, at least if the rich young man Christ was speaking to were to have the unearthly courage to follow this command, because this is the famous command, go, wade, wende, sell everything which you possess and give it to poor people, and you will have a treasure, thesauron, in kailis, in heaven, in the heavens, literally plural. St. Matthew likes to use the plural of heavens in his gospel. And come. All right, if you look at that, you might think, is that the perfect? But no, it's just another imperative, right? Weni. Okay, sequere. Now that we have deponent verbs with all these passive forms, we're going to need to know what passive imperatives look like. Unfortunately, they look just like active infinitives. So if you see something that looks like an active infinitive ending, but you have some reason to believe you're in the passive. For example, you looked up sequor and you found out it's a deponent verb. All its forms are passive and means to follow. It takes direct objects. It's totally active in meaning. Well, that's the passive imperative. Follow me, sequere me. So, all right, it's important to realize Augustine is still in his indirect statement. In fact, he forgot that he was using quod plus a subjunctive. He suddenly jumps into accusative plus infinitive. And he's still saying, though, what he had heard that Anthony did. So let's imagine that he used the words audieram Antonium to give us our accusative for the accusative plus infinitive. I had heard that Anthony. So he'd also heard that Anthony, well, here's the perfect passive infinitive. Do you remember that one? I had heard that Anthony had been converted. Okay, perfect passive infinitive in an indirect statement by such an oracle, right? An oracle is when God speaks directly to you. So that's an appropriate word for this kind of situation. That he'd been suddenly converted to you. Augustine's always talking to God, so that's God. So he turned to God because he happened to walk into a church and heard the gospel being proclaimed in which Jesus said, go and sell everything you have. And thus, being hurried or excited, concitus, I went back into that place in eum locum, ubi Alypius sedebat, where my friend Alypius was sitting. Because there, ibi, in that place, I had placed, right, pluperfect of pono, I had placed a book of the apostle. Well, that's the Apostle Paul, the only apostle who would need an entire book for his writings in the New Testament. I had placed a book of the apostle. Now here, cum is cum the conjunction. It sometimes takes subjunctive when it has a meaning like because, although, but here it just means when, so it takes the indicative. Just, don't confuse it with the preposition cum plus ablative. They're two different words. So there I had placed the book of the apostle when I had risen, I had gotten up thence, when I had gotten up from there, right? All right, then rapid fire, 3 first person singular perfect active indicative verbs. Ripui, aperui, legi. I took it up. I opened it and I read in silence the chapter. Quo primum conjecti sunt oculi mei, where my eyes, the nominative subject, first, modifying chapters, the first chapter where conjecti sunt, they were cast, they happened to fall. Okay, conjecti sunt is just the verb of our subordinate clause here. It is the third person plural perfect passive indicative of conicio. And here are the words he found. Non in commissationibus. Well, commissationibus, which your dictionary will have with a double S, is a very fancy word for a riotous revel of a drinking party or something like that, with a Greek etymology. I'm going to read this is from Romans 13, and 14. I'm going to read a translation. It's just an epic long, not in. And by the way, St. Paul never used a verb in this half of what he said. Sometimes he could be a little elliptical that way. So the verb to understand is something like, let us not conduct ourselves in all these things. Okay, he's just exhorting his Romans, he's written the letter to, not to go around hanging out in situations like this. So not in rioting and drunkenness, ebrietatibus, right, like inebriation. Not in chambering is the old-fashioned word used in the translation I'm reading, because a kubile is literally just a bed chamber. So not in bed chambers or chambering and impurities, not in contention and envy, emulatione. But, and then now he sort of switches construction. He goes into an actual sentence where the verb is an imperative. We get two commands. But put on the Lord Jesus Christ, right? This is a word you can use for putting on clothes. That's a common metaphor St. Paul will use. But put on the Lord Jesus Christ, and we get ne plus perfect subjunctive. That's prohibitive subjunctive. We've seen now for the second time, it's just a standard way Latin can use to give a negative command. We learned in the textbook, noli and nolite plus the infinitive. Well, here's another way that's just as common. So put on Lord Jesus Christ, do that as command number one. And command number two is in the prohibitive subjunctive because it's something not to do. And do not make provision, for the flesh. So literally do not make providence of the flesh, right? Do not make provision for the flesh. That's carnis is genitive. In the concupiscences of the flesh. All right, then. In its desires and lusts, in other words. And if you've read Augustine's Confessions up to this point, and you know what his life was like, you can understand very well how convicted he was and how he took this as totally 110% applicable to exactly his situation in his life. Well, that's where St. Paul was telling people not to hang out. That's exactly where he was hanging out. Nec ultra volui legere, nec opus erat. Neither did I wish to read further, legere ultra in adverb modifying legere, to read further. Nec opus erat, nor was there any need, right? Opus est means it is necessary, it is needful. Opus erat in the imperfect. I probably should have made opus blue. And straight away, indeed, with the end of this sentence, don't worry about the CE on the end of huios. There's an archaic form that shows up again in late Latin a lot, of hic haec hoc, that's just hic. It's got that sort of ke on the end, but just ignore it. It means the same thing. It just means. So straight away with the end of this sentence, the sentence of Paul that he found when he opened the book at random. I'm taking luce infusa as an ablative absolute. So we have our translation strategies again. If lux means light and it's in the ablative, and the participle infusus means poured into, it's a perfect passive participle, then putting poured in light in the ablative means I can translate it when or because light had been poured in, light having been poured in, or just light got poured in and. So how do we want to translate it? Immediately together with the end of this sentence, as if, well, since I have a nice conjunction here, as if, I'll use it and do the subordinate clause method, as if a light of safety, security had been poured into my heart. It's very common if a verb has a preposition prefix like in, then if you want to specify what it got poured into, we usually use the dative for that. into my heart. And all the darkness, tenebrae, a plural noun, but with a singular translation, it just means darkness. All the darkness of my dubitatio, my uncertainty, my hesitation, my doubt, diffugerunt. It scattered in all directions. It was dispersed. Okay, that's what it took for Augustine. Thanks. Thank you for going through this passage with me. I hope you found it helpful.